All right, so I think while others will still probably be trickling in, we'll get started. First of all, we're really happy to welcome you here. We understand in terms of the time difference, we might have a very, very global audience, obviously those who are very interested by our topic. And so to start with a little bit of the overview of our agenda today, I will start with a quick presentation of the participants, our speakers, notably the theme, the main kind of questions we're going to talk about. And then you'll see that we have left, a good portion of the end of the webinar to really have a question and answer session. And so we will try and address your questions by chat. So feel free as you, are listening to the questions to start noting and putting them directly into the chat. What we'll do is try and group them and we'll not, forget them, and we'll regroup them for the end of the conversation. Because we do have some initial questions we want to pose to the speakers. So don't hesitate to, also if you have questions or other, resources, we'll start also animating the chat through that. So with that, I'll get started. To present myself, I'm Jean Guo. I'm the founder and CEO of Connexio. What do? We are an organization that makes digital technology synonymous with opportunity by training society's most vulnerable people in digital skills. We work from programs that go from the most basic to most advanced, and we have a clear mission to really facilitate the socio-economic inclusion of the people we work with. So, we have specific programs since 2016 to really uplift refugees, unemployed youth, and others. And part of our mission is really to foster this world where diversity and inclusion are part of our core values. And so, why we're here today is that given our work, in France, in Malawi, and in the near term in other countries as well, with refugees and with operating partners like the UNHCR, we realize that, livelihoods is becoming one of those really key topics. We know, for example, at the end of 2020, there were 82.4 million displaced persons worldwide. These individuals are talented, they're resilient, they're motivated, yet they're systematically left out of livelihood opportunities due to economic, legal, and structural barriers. And despite attempts at international standard settings, 70% of refugees live in countries with restricted rights to work. 66% of them live in countries with restricted freedoms of movement, and 47% of them live in countries with restricted access to bank accounts. These barriers assume that being a refugee is a short-term experience. However, as some of you know better than me, the average length of stay in a refugee camp is quite long. It varies from 10 to 26 years. And we know that a long-term problem really does require long-term solutions and obviously coordination within the ecosystem. We've seen that studies have shown that improving these longer term livelihoods and opportunities for refugees can enhance their productivity, promote greater self-reliance, and help people to either gain sources of living lost during displacement or cultivate new ones. Increasingly, livelihoods has also led to improved mental health, according to various studies, educational outcomes, food security, as well as a greater sense of wellness and hope. So how do we move forward towards a model of inclusion and improve self-reliance? How do you improve livelihoods and the labor market integration of refugees with these challenges? To begin to answer these questions, we will hear from Sasha Chenov and Simar Singh from the NGO Refuge Point and their initiative, their self-reliance initiative, Tim Docking from the Refugee Investment Network to talk about strategies as an impact investing firm and their attempts at standard setting within with the refugee lens, what they will talk about. And last but definitely not least, Celine Schmidt from UNHCR France to give us the broader perspective and also how to mobilize different stakeholders within the ecosystem. To better present our different speakers, I'll begin with Sasha. Sasha is the founder and executive director of Refuge Point, a humanitarian organization that finds lasting solutions for the world's most at-risk refugees and supports the humanitarian community to do the same. He is the co-author of From Crisis to Calling, Finding Your Moral Center in the Toughest Decisions, with the foreword by David Gergen. He is a recipient of the Schwab Foundation World Economic Forum Social Entrepreneur of the Year Award, the Harvard Center for Public Leadership Weitzman International Activist Award, and an Obama White House Champion of Change. He has received numerous social entrepreneur fellowships. He is a member of the New England International Donors and advisor to the Good Life Fund, the philanthropic arm of the Warner Brothers film The Good Life, about the resettlement of the South Sudanese lost boys and girls. Now on to Tim. Tim is a managing director director of the Refugee Investment Network, the first impact investing collaborative dedicated to creating durable solutions to global forced migration. Prior to establishing RIN, Tim was a business executive and has 20 years of emerging market and public sector experience. At the IBM Corporation, he worked at the intersection of business, technology, and international development. As a leader in the public sector, he helped launch the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a U.S. government development agency. Tim started his career as a Peace Corps volunteer working in Mali. Next, we have Celine, who is a Senior External Relations Officer and spokesperson for UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in France. She has been working for UNHCR since 2007, alternately at the headquarters in Geneva and on the field in the Great Lakes region of Africa. Particularly in the DRC and Burundi. She joined the Paris office in 2015 with a role to engage and develop partnerships with various actors to create a favorable environment for refugees arriving in Europe, including projects between UNHCR and its partners, including civil society, and to ensure the participation of refugees in decisions impacting their lives. Before UNHCR, she worked for an NGO in Cape Verde and for the French Embassy in Tanzania. And finally, to present Simar. Simar is a senior programs manager at Refuge Point, where she manages the strategic evolution and implementation of Refuge Point's global initiatives on refugee self-reliance. She also serves as the agency lead for the initiative, the Self-Reliance Initiative, and has over 15 years of experience in developing human rights and humanitarian policy and standards of practice to improve the lives of people affected by war and other crises. So we have a distinguished panel of speakers for us this afternoon or tonight based on the region of the world you're in. And with that, I would like to dive right into our questions. So I think the first question I have up here is for Celine. I know that UNHCR just published a new global trends report for 2020. Can you give us some global context and key figures regarding refugee livelihoods?
Thank you very much, Jean. And first of all, I'm very happy to be in such a great panel tonight with all of you and to discuss such an important topic for us at UNHCR. So as you said in your introduction, there are today more than 82 million people who are displaced worldwide. The majority of them being displaced internally in their country, more than 45 million people now who are internally displaced within their own country, but also more than 26 million refugees. The numbers have again increased between 2019 and 2020, and now the number have increased over the last 10 years, and it's now an unprecedented number of people displaced worldwide. So the situation is worrying and really, calls for attention and for action of everyone. And I know we're going to talk later about the role of everyone, but everyone really has a role to play to find solutions for refugees. In terms of where the refugees are and in which region and where they're coming from, and also what is the situation today, what are the challenges they're facing today, 2/3 of the refugees worldwide are coming from just 5 situations. They're coming from Syria. Displaced people outside of their country are also coming from Venezuela, from Afghanistan, from South Sudan, and from Myanmar. Many of them are now displaced for many years. What we see, and this is a reason of the increase of the number of people displaced worldwide, is that there are protracted situations. Displacement situations getting longer, people being displaced, sometimes for several decades. You know, if we take, for example, the situation of Afghans being displaced, being refugees, we are talking about Afghan refugees since more than 4 decades. Syrian refugees are displaced now for more than 10 years as well. So situations, displacement situations are getting protracted, but also new crises have started last year, and people are being displaced in new regions in the world. And we can talk, for example, about the situation in the Sahel that is really worrying for us, but also the situation in Ethiopia. refugees fleeing from Ethiopia into Sudan, people being displaced in the north of Mozambique. So this really calls for attention and for response from all of us. And on top of that, an additional challenge, and I think it's very important to talk about that as well, because it's also linked to economic inclusion. Another additional challenge is linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. When we think about the pandemic, we think of health, the consequences for people in terms of health and access to health, of course, but there also have been very serious socio-economic consequences of the pandemic, and especially for people who are being displaced, with many refugees who've lost their income, because many of them are working also in the informal sector. And this is also something very worrying and also needs for action, to see how can we work together to support refugees who've lost their income, who lost their jobs, what can be done together now and in the future, because the consequences of today will be long term. There will be long-term consequences, and it's really we're really asking partners to pay attention to that. So that's the current context and the situation, which is, as I said, worrying.
No, thank you so much, Celine, for giving us kind of the global view, especially link it to the pandemic, which I think is forefront in everyone's minds, and then kind of maybe moving on from that to really talk about the types of actors that are involved in responding to the crisis. I would love to move it to Sasha to maybe talk a little bit more about Refuge Point's work, and then also specifically the focus on self-reliance. I know that you guys have specific work in Canada and in Kenya regarding that, and also make a note to the audience that Sasha will hop off in the middle, but we will also kind of parlay with us Simar, who will continue the questions regarding the self-reliance initiative for Refuge Point.
Thanks so much, Jean. And it is such an honor and a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. Refuge Point is a partner to UNHCR around the world. UNHCR, of course, plays a unique and invaluable role across the world. And as Celine highlighted, we need to find new solutions. And I've been particularly inspired watching the growth of Connexio. I think Connexio represents one of the new dimensions of humanitarian response, which is a technology dimension, looking at technology and how refugees can actually improve their lives through technology interventions. And so I've been really inspired, Jean, talking to you as Connexio has grown, looking at your work in France and in Malawi and with your aspirations in other countries as well. And I hope to see those succeed and hope to support those. And just with Refugee Investment Network and Tim and their work, that is critical also because they bring a new lens of investing, of impact investing into this space. So it's an honor to be here. Refuge Point started because we found that many refugees fell through the cracks of humanitarian assistance. One of the trends that we've seen, in addition to what Celine has highlighted, is that more and more refugees are saying no to refugee camps, and they're deciding to try to find solutions or improve their lives in cities and urban areas. The majority of refugees are no longer in refugee camps. And so in addition to the growing numbers of refugees, there's a growing migration to urban areas. Refuge Point started because we found many refugees who fell through the cracks of assistance, and our engagement was to find solutions for the most at-risk refugees, and we do that in two ways. One of them is through resettlement and other pathways to help refugees who can't survive where they are get to countries where they can rebuild their lives. And the other is to look at how refugees can reestablish themselves in the places to which they fled so they can build independent lives there. Humanitarian aid doesn't match the needs today, and so we need to find ways that refugees can be included both socially and economically, and that's a key. So what Refuge Point does is we have a flagship program in Nairobi where we enable refugees through a variety of different kinds of support to get on their own 2 feet. We provide some emergency services, but we start that engagement with an orientation toward what people can do for themselves. And it's really interesting. I've spent 25 years working in the refugee protection space, and often those conversations start from the place of vulnerability. What have you gone through? What terrors have you experienced? And how can we help you resettle or get to a place better? But when you start the conversations from the perspective of what is your experience? What are your abilities? What jobs did you do before? That is a conversation that's really rooted in dignity. And we found that many people respond so positively to that because it's often what we found in our interviews and our discussions and engagements, the first time that people are being asked about what their skills and experiences are. And so we know that right now, there is an urgent need to find pathways to self-reliance for refugees. Again, to add to what Celine said, the Global Compact on Refugees, which was affirmed by virtually every country in the world, has as one of its 4 pillars self-reliance. That means that countries around the world recognize the need for refugee self-reliance. And in addition, the Sustainable Development Goals include refugees now. So there's really a broad framework for self-reliance for refugees. Refuge Point has this flagship program in Nairobi, and through a way of measuring impact, we have seen that we've enabled thousands of refugees to get to a point of extreme vulnerability, to a point where they're supporting themselves and don't need assistance anymore. As we saw that we were successful in that endeavor, we started looking to train and support other organizations to do that in Nairobi and more broadly in the region. And we recognized some key gaps in humanitarian response. One of them was that while refugee self-reliance is an aspiration, there was no common definition. There was no common way to measure impact of programs. And so along with the Women's Refugee Commission and many other partners, we launched the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative with the goal of reaching 5 million people in 5 years with programming that puts them on a path to self-reliance, creating a way to measure impact, sharing information and knowledge, and looking to use that to advocate for improved situations for refugees. So the Self-Reliance Initiative, one of the key things that we did at the start was to create the Refugee Self-Reliance Index, which, Jean, you know all about because I know Connexio has been exploring. And that index is now being used in 13 countries with more than 20 partners to help measure the impact. And we're seeing that the State Department and a new funding mechanism at the EU called Lives and Dignity are actually using that self-reliance index as a suggested tool to measure impact of the programming they're funding. So what we hope to do broadly is help to switch the humanitarian response paradigm toward one that is inclusive, that sees refugees move towards self-reliance. A final point I'll make, and a concern that I have, is that there's a lot of talk around the importance of livelihoods, and that's certainly critical to enable refugee livelihoods. But if you asked 100 refugees how many people are ready to start a business or engage in livelihoods now, perhaps 5 or 10 would raise their hand. You would have the vast majority who have additional needs beyond those and aren't able, in fact, to start livelihoods because they have so many critical and urgent needs. So Refuge Point's focus is on really vulnerable refugees. We call our program in Nairobi a self-reliance runway approach, where we help people with some of those urgent needs to the point where they can start and build businesses. And we want to make sure that that's embedded in the understanding of how to move forward with self-reliance opportunities, because if we just focus on livelihoods without recognizing those other factors that are barriers, as Celine mentioned, health and COVID, such a significant and important one, we're not going to be able to help the majority of people engage in livelihoods in the first place. So thanks again. It's a real honor to be here.
No, thank you so much, Sasha. And it's really admirable to see what you guys have been able to do and the people that you've been able to impact. And I think totally, I'm totally in line with the point of being able to work in partnership with other organizations and realize that to get people to a certain measure of self-reliance, that it really has to come from, being able to tackle, different needs that come from, the basics of health and shelter, all the way to start, thinking about economic inclusion. So I think having a pathway approach or runway approach is really important. And kind of to close off kind of this first cycle of questions with Tim, I think it's very interesting. We have heard from, UNHCR, from Refuge Point, some of the key players in this ecosystem. Can you tell us, about the Refugee Investment Network, and as an impacting investing firm, what are, the difference in approach and the key strengths, of the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks, Jean. I'll just start off by echoing my colleagues and thanking you and thanking Connexio for organizing this really important theme and really importantly timed call, I think. This is a subject that I think deserves all the attention we can give it. And so it's really a pleasure to join this panel and to speak on this theme. I'm also really thankful to have an opportunity to speak about the Refugee Investment Network. We call it the RIN. The RIN has been around for about 3 years. And we are a first of a kind impact investing collaborative network, if you will, that serves as an intermediary dedicated to finding durable solutions to forced migration. You said that in effect, Jean, at the outset, but I would just underscore we're an intermediary. We're not a fund. We're not an investment vehicle per se, but we're a social enterprise that connects interested capital partners from across the capital continuum. And I know for some people, perhaps in the humanitarian space or development space, capital continuum might throw you off. But it's if you can imagine a continuum from those who are grantors to those seeking commercial rates of return on their investment, it does form a continuum that RIN seeks to address. And many of those folks along that continuum are interested in RIN and the refugee lens investing, which we promote and that I'll come back to later in this conversation and describe in more detail. We're investor facing, we're demand driven, and we see ourselves really responding to impact capital partners looking for a home. Just to not get too wonky on everybody, but our theory of change is really based on 4 pillars. And I think by sort of illuminating what those are, it helps to explain many of the initiatives, again, which I'll return to, I think, in the course of our call. Our first pillar in our theory of change is to build out this field of refugee lens investing. When we got started, we spent a lot of time meeting with some of the founders of the gender lens investment movement, and they really were sage and gave us some great great advice on building our own impact and investing lens. So the lens represents one of the initiatives under that pillar of building out the field of refugee lens investing. Our second pillar is really focused on mobilizing capital through that lens. And again, I can talk more about how we're doing that in practice. The third pillar is all about changing that negative narrative that surrounds forcibly displaced people, that one that casts displaced people as a burden on society, or perhaps a threat, to a narrative that really presents displaced people as an opportunity, as investable, as hard workers, as innovative. And then that final pillar, which I mentioned, that really drives the RIN, is policy change, because I think as Celine was mentioning, and you mentioned at the outset, I think, Jean, if the policy environment isn't pro-refugee or permissible for people to integrate into society, integrate socially, integrate economically, all this other work will be for naught. And so the RIN has developed a lens which we believe really complements the lens which Sasha described at high level, and I know Samar will describe in more detail, which we call the Refugee Opportunity Index, which is a partnership we have with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and which Refuge Point helped us construct, was a part of our expert panel that came up with the indicators for that. So that's sort of high level, Jean, and probably a good starting point for the people attending the call today to get a sense of what the Refugee Investment Network does.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I think it gives a good overview and kind of a teaser for a lot of the points we'll kind of come back to later in the discussion. And I invite also all the participants on the call as you're, hearing a lot of the different points that are going to be evoked. Don't hesitate to ask questions, and then we'll, work to address them in the right order at the end of my Q&A part for the speakers. So I think maybe something I want to come back to, and this is more Celine, is that we started talking about, that there is definitely kind of a different, needs that have been evoked, some, especially, when we were talking about COVID earlier, and you were saying the impact on those who also, lost economic opportunity. Can you maybe dive a little bit more into issues regarding economic inclusion and integration from the UNHCR perspective?
Yes, of course, Jean. And economic inclusion and access to work is something essential for refugees, for their protection and to help them to rebuild their lives. But in order to help them to access employment and to be economically included in the countries, there needs to be an enabling environment to help them to get there. And it has already been mentioned by Sasha before, but in order to arrive to that environment that helps and supports refugees access employment, there are different things that have to be put in place. And first of all, it's access to housing, access to documents, all of this have to go together with the support to refugees to access job and their support for economic inclusion, because there are barriers for refugees. We can talk, for example, also about the need for psychological support for refugees, because people who flee conflict, who flee persecution, can have trauma and need to have a proper support to be able to rebuild their life and to access jobs. But also very often refugees, when they arrive in a country, they lack the social network that is very often needed to access job, to know what are the opportunities. Language also is very often an issue, so access to language classes is also something very important. So I think here, what is important, of course, to talk about refugee inclusion is to think about that in a holistic manner. And all the different things and keys that have to be put in place to enable people to access work. And this is why it's very important to work together with different partners, and to address the issues. In France, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, we set up a coordination platform together with our government partners, which is the interministerial delegation in charge of reception and integration of refugees, to see how various actors can, change and adapt their programs, taking into account the consequences of the pandemic. How can they support language classes, despite the pandemic, despite the lockdown? How can refugees continue to study, to have access to higher education despite the pandemic? How can we tackle the needs for psychological support, for social cohesion, when everyone is at home and and when social interaction and opportunities are very limited. And I must say, it was really, really helpful to work together with all these partners and think together what has to be put in place to continue and support refugees, integrate in the societies hosting them, and access job. Because one of the major issues that was highlighted and that was stressed by refugees at the beginning of the pandemic was the fear of losing an income and losing employment. So yeah, very important to tackle all the challenges that refugees face in the process of accessing employment.
And I think, even building on to that, with the self-reliance index, maybe to talk about that, and also realizing that, in even trying to define this itself, it's multifaceted, it's more complicated, you know, as Celine is saying, you take into account multiple types of needs along the path. So, you know, what, you know, Samir, can you tell us a little bit more about the index, the different dimensions that are required to really measure this, and kind of the, for example, going from the safety and security issues, we need to really think about building a stability to kind of other aspects that we take into account, or that you guys take into account in the index.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jean. And thank you so much to Connexio for bringing us together to have this really important discussion. I think I'll sort of start by just unpacking a bit what self-reliance means as a concept. And to start, I'd say, you know, in light of the very sobering statistics that Celine shared at the outset, it should come as no surprise that refugees repeatedly tell us that what they want is the chance to work, the chance to be able to provide for themselves and their families, and the chance to rebuild their lives. So at its core, when we talk about self-reliance, what we're really talking about is supporting refugees in their own aspirations to be able to take care of themselves and their families without being in a constant state of dependence on humanitarian assistance. So self-reliance is about helping refugees live better lives where they are now, and not only waiting for the opportunity to resettle elsewhere, to be able to go back to their home country, or for host countries to provide full rights. It's really about creating opportunities for refugees to access dignified livelihoods that allow them to improve the quality of their life without delay, and to build resilience against shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Celine talked a little bit about how that's been so disruptive for all of us, but also for refugees in particular. And self-reliance is about doing all of this while refugees continue to await some of those longer-term durable solutions. So while the concept of self-reliance is sort of understandable and probably relatable to many of us, unpacking what it takes is a little bit more complex. So at the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, you know, we've done quite a bit of work to really think about the concept, and what we've come up with through a lot of research and interviews and work over several years is that there are many interdependent factors that go into improving self-reliance for refugee families. This includes things like economic stability, health and nutrition, education, a sense of safety and social connectedness, really all of the things that all of us on this call today are concerned about in our own daily lives. So it's not the sort of abstract concept, it's things that all of us are thinking about on a daily basis. And despite being recognized as an objective in the Global Compact on Refugees and other high-level agreements and frameworks, until recently, we actually haven't had a way to track and measure self-reliance and to know more broadly whether our programs, services, and aid have all added up to improved lives for refugees. So that's where the idea for the Self-Reliance Index came in. A year ago, just over a year ago, the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative launched the Self-Reliance Index, which is the first global tool to measure the journey of refugee families on their paths to self-reliance. The index is made up of 12 different domains or themes that cover both the economic and the social dimensions of a refugee household's life. So those domains or themes really include things as diverse as housing, education, health, financial resources, employment, social networks, safety, and a number of others. So it's really intended to provide this holistic view, very much in line with what Celine was mentioning. When we're thinking of self-reliance, it certainly includes livelihoods and employment, but it's really a lot more than that for it to be sustainable and possible and accessible. I'll just add that, you know, one unique aspect of the Self-Reliance Index is that it has been designed to account for both the vulnerabilities, but also the strengths and assets of refugee families. Based on a series of questions that we have in the index related to the 12 domains, the index tells us how a refugee family is doing in all of these areas, pointing out areas of strength and areas of need as well. And so it really provides a holistic picture of how families are doing and tracks change over time, which allows us as practitioners, policymakers, funders to make educated decisions about what priorities we have for our programs, how best to sort of monitor and understand the impact of our programs, and how to support better collaboration between partner agencies. So I'll stop there and we can dig into this a little bit more later.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think it's really good that you're mentioning, you're looking at some of the vulnerabilities, but also trying to give value to the assets, the different strengths. I think it's really important to have a more holistic sense. And then kind of for Tim, this question regarding, and I know we talked about this in our prep for the event, is, sometimes when we think about supporting an ecosystem and also to better give clarity to the work that RIN does, what are some of the misconceptions, you've heard about investing in kind of refugee-related initiatives? And maybe there you can also talk about the refugee lens.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. I mean, there are so many misconceptions. And I imagine even when many on this call hear this idea of refugee investing, their mind immediately goes to the refugee entrepreneur. I'll come back to this point later, but that's a beginning misconception that I think many people share. But I would say generally, not this crowd, but I think very generally, again, as we talk with the impact investing community, faith-based investors, development agencies interested in our model, we still run up against folks that have the following sort of false beliefs. One, refugees aren't investable. Two, it's impossible to source, to find an investment that is investable. It's really difficult, for example, they may think, to measure impact. Others have told us, you can't lend to someone who's been displaced because they're not creditworthy. Of course, we all know, we've heard that refugees may not have the skills or the education. Or that perhaps, coming back to the point that I mentioned at the outset, the refugee investments only equal startups or refugee entrepreneurs. And, it's these things that I think hold back money, hold back capital from engaging, from rolling up their sleeves and trying to source investment opportunities that would have a favorable impact on displacement, on displaced people, and help to create self-reliance. And so this really gets, Jean, to the reason, the gap that the RIN tries to fill in this space. We have all heard of ESG investing, environment, social, government investing. Happily, and as you know, the amount of money being poured into ESG investments is enormous and growing in leaps and bounds. Almost 40% over the last 2 years increases in pension funds and retail investment going into this space. And so it's really critical that we define this space and lead a way for people to invest not only in not only in the environment space, which you're probably all aware of green funds, for example, or green bonds, or these sorts of things. What we hear from impact investors is that they would like more opportunities in the S space, and that social investing, and again, are drawn to our model because of that. So what is our model? I've referred to it a couple times, but the refugee investment lens is a pretty simple taxonomy that we can share a link with you later too. You can find on our website, but it was really built off of our consultations with the Gender Lens Investing Group. And what they said to us was, several things are really important as you put this together and you work with an investment community. You have to sort of keep it straightforward and simple. You want to avoid the perhaps off-putting discussions about refugees versus internally displaced people versus asylum seekers versus host communities. So come up with some pretty firm definitions and create an aperture through which to move money, to mobilize funds, going back to our theory of change, that isn't asking an investment community to thread the needle. Keep it broad enough that you can interest a lot of different individuals, but keep it specific enough and in a framework so that you can measure impact, and that and you can encourage intentionality of the investors and in the investees as well. So just real high level, really in brief, we break it down into 6 parts. We call an R1, a refugee one investment, one that is a refugee entrepreneur, one where our mind immediately goes, is that refugee entrepreneur, the startup. Those investments would appeal to probably more of those investors on, if you will, the left side of that investment continuum that I referred to earlier, those angel investors, those grantors. As you get into R2, R3, R4 investments, which would be refugee-led, would be an R2, refugee supporting would be an R3, host community supporting would be an R4 investment, then you really broaden the aperture to all sorts of capital that would range from concessional investors, those seeking just a return on investment plus a few points, to those that are more commercially oriented. The last 2 categories, R5, are debt fund that are intentional about investing in those first 4 sorts of investments that I mentioned, R1 through R4. And the 6th R would refer to investment funds. Our 6 investments are funds, and we work with several refugee investment funds that are starting up or already started, that are investing, again, in those investments, R1 through R4. And if I haven't thoroughly confused everybody, Jean, we will share that framework. And I'll just say that in the investment community, in the impact investing community, that has really appealed to people. And it's been the first time that an intermediary like Rin has stepped up and said, we can do this. We can build a framework around this. We can measure it. We can identify it. We can source, and we can direct capital in an impactful way that supports a community that really needs sort of investment and capital investment to help with self-reliance and to create jobs.
No, I think, thank you, Tim. And I imagine it's not the R1 to the R6, but, we definitely will. I think we've sent out the link so you guys can look into that a little bit more and see the differences, and also, not get caught up on thinking that, when we think of refugee investments, that, there's only kind of one typology, but there's really kind of this need also to have a variety of different instruments available. So I think one of the things, we open up with the problem, we open up to really define a little bit more what we mean by self-reliance, what we mean by refugee investment. And I think now I want to get into kind of this idea of mobilizing others and partnerships. And kind of to come back to Celine, I'd like to talk about maybe the global compact, and especially, knowing that we can't go and do it alone. And especially if we're thinking about pathways or runways, that you need kind of different actors at different stages to be involved. So Celine, can you talk about the work with the Global Impact? How does that allow you to mobilize different types of stakeholders, and what kind of different actors are brought to the table?
Yeah, thank you, Jean, for the question. So for those who don't know, the Global Compact on Refugees was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2018. After 2 years of work, consultations by UNHCR with different partners, member states, international organizations, civil society, refugees, the private sector, and experts, to develop a framework for more predictable responsibility sharing, solidarity, international collaboration, cooperation, to find sustainable solutions for refugee situations. Because it's clear that solutions can't be found without international cooperation, without working all together. And that was already stated in the introduction of the 51 Geneva Convention, that protection of refugees has to be done using and international cooperation as a tool to protect refugees. So through the Global Compact, we now have that tool that enables everyone to work together, bring different partners to work together, because everyone has a role to play. There are 4 objectives, if I can summarize, of the Global Compact on refugees. One is to ease the pressure on the host countries, because the compact was adopted by the UN member states, the member states of General Assembly at a time when already, the number of refugees worldwide was growing, and there was clearly a need for solutions and for a kind of a new deal to find solutions, to share responsibility with the countries hosting the majority of the refugees in the world, to enhance refugee self-reliance, and we've spoken already about self-reliance, but also to expand the solutions for refugees, and ultimately also, to support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity for refugees. After the adoption of the Global Compact on refugees, so 1 year after, we organized the first Global Refugee Forum in Geneva in December 2019, bringing together more than 3,000 people, heads of states, representatives of governments, but also CEOs of companies, representatives of civil society, representatives of refugees, to talk together about the situation worldwide for refugees, but also what can be achieved to find solutions. And we called on different partners to pledge for solutions. And there were more than 300 pledges at the conference, including pledges by the private sector, to provide access to training, access to employment for refugees, but also pledges for more funding for access to education, innovative solutions for access to education to refugees, pledges by governments to provide more resettlement places. And Sasha has mentioned, the need for legal pathways also for refugees, including other legal pathways that could be private sponsorship, scholarship for refugee students. So really, the compact gives us the opportunity for different partners to work together and to find solutions together, because everyone has a role to play. The private sector has a role to play in providing funding, of course, but also providing solutions, innovative solutions. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we spoke a lot about long distance learning as well. So again, to respond to the challenges of the pandemic, the Global Compact is really a useful tool. And we really think that there is now a tool to bring partners together and to work together to find solutions.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think there's a lot of different initiatives, and I think part of it is making sure that, there's also kind of cross-fertilization between a lot of these kind of consortiums and different actors. So kind of moving to Tim, not that we want to confuse you by throwing you one more index, but I will. But I think it's important. Can you, in the sense of also talking about mobilization, talk about the Refugee Opportunity Index? I know you alluded to it in the first question, and how maybe in that sense, this will help to bring also different actors together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just real briefly, when we started out, we set up our theory of change, and we said, geez, if we can't get things right in this policy environment or begin to change, not in every country, but probably in most countries, sort of these anti-outsider, anti-refugee sort of policies that are on the books, we're going to not, be as successful as we want to be in these other areas. And so we conceptualized an index that would really shine a bright light on state policy, on national policy. And we reached out to the Economist Intelligence Unit because we were familiar with some of the indexes they had created. And I reached back to some of the work I had done earlier in my career on the Millennium Challenge Corporation, looking at some of the score sheets that they they created for countries to qualify for development assistance. And we came up with something that we called the ROI. And the double entendre there, return on investment, refugee opportunity index was intentional. And working with EIU and convening a panel of experts, we came up with 45 policy indicators that would provide a benchmark for national policy towards forcibly displaced people. And just real quickly, we look at questions about things, everything from like freedom of movement, to freedom to join the formal sector and to get a work permit, access to social services, whether or not people, men versus women, women versus men are allowed to start a business, whether or not women receive the same treatment as men, doing things like with regards to travel and transport and these sorts of things, all indicators that we seek to, again, benchmark and to create an index. We're currently rolling one out in the Latin America regional index of 7 countries there that's supported by the Inter-American Development Bank. They're very much interested in using this index to identify both policy strengths and policy weaknesses so that they can encourage some of the partners in the region to follow the examples of good examples and to, for example, take their technical assistance and direct it more effectively at areas that need to be strengthened within a country with regards to migration and refugees. So we feel like the ROI is an innovation that will, beyond that, and bringing it back full circle to our mission to mobilize capital and to build this impact investing thematic, we hope that the ESG investor picks it up and says, oh, this is a stamp of good housekeeping. Maybe one country versus another country may be more successful in their policy formation. It's something that we will use as one of the criterion to choose a country for foreign direct investment, for example. So we hope that the benchmark becomes a bit of as we say in the US, a stamp of good housekeeping, and it inspires governments to improve on their policies, and creates perhaps a bit of a demonstration effect in certain regions. We're planning to do an index as well in the Greater Horn of Africa, sort of the Horn of Africa plus Uganda and maybe another country or two there. And we hope that demonstration effect, because of the widely varying policies that are on the books in countries, helps to create sort of a virtuous cycle for improving in some of these areas that are really important.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting work, and would love to follow up and see, as things move ahead and the countries where that could be created, to see, where that work takes you guys. And to kind of close it off on this theme of kind of mobilizing different actors and stakeholders, I know that Sasha mentioned that you guys, work, for example, with UNHCR at different, points in different locations. Can you, talk about, Seymour, a little bit your approach at Refuge Point to mobilize other types of stakeholders? And how does maybe social innovation play a role in all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Refuge Point, when we consider how to help refugees live better lives and improve their lives, at the highest level, we're really looking to transform refugee response to create more opportunities for refugees to become self-reliant while they pursue durable solutions. What we really want is to see more humanitarian agencies implementing self-reliance programming. We want funders to fund this work, and we want governments to create enabling environments for the refugees that they host. So at the highest level, those are our goals. And it's really that ambition that calls for partnerships and new ways of working together. We know it's certainly not something we can even attempt to do by ourselves. And so that's very much sort of aligned with the collaborative and creative approach that Refuge Point takes in all of our work. Partnerships are central to the way in which we operate. And perhaps one example of this is the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative that we mentioned earlier. It's an initiative that Refuge Point co-created and co-leads along with the Women's Refugee Commission. It's an initiative that really brings together people working across different sectors to exchange knowledge and learning, to learn from each other, and to create new and better ways to help more refugees become and stay self-reliant. And so by really that sort of cross-pollination and bringing people together to think about new ways in addressing some of these intractable issues that we deal with, that's really where social innovation is sort of at the heart of our work. The initiative today sort of serves as the global convening space and learning space for self-reliance. We have a global community that's growing. We have about 40 different organizations, including international NGOs, refugee-led organizations, UN agencies. UNHCR, of course, has been an early and critical partner in this work. But we also have think tanks, researchers, government and private funders who are all part of this initiative. So we really think about, you know, if we want to transform the system, if we want to have this sort of holistic change, I think Celine mentioned at the outset, everyone has a role to play in this. That's certainly something we see. And so we created an initiative to bring everyone together. You know, we know that humanitarians just sort of traditionally are not very engaged with the private sector. And so when Tim sort of describes the work that the RIN is doing, that's really crucial knowledge for humanitarians to have, to both think about how can we partner together better, but also, you know, if we're looking for new ways to support the refugees we work with, if we're, you know, all working towards the same goals, how do we come together, you know, in some ways share knowledge and speak the same language to create solutions that are ultimately going to be stronger. And so that idea of social innovation is really, you know, in some ways, like, comes together in a pretty simple way, which is we bring everyone who has a stake in this issue or who's thinking about it to the table to share ideas and very much to work in collaboration to come up with new ways of working. That's also really the story of the Self-Reliance Index. You know, it's a tool that was developed together with all of the members of the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative over a number of years, and it's helping organizations fill a gap in the field, and it's helping many agencies improve their self-reliance programs, and ultimately will help to build an evidence base of effective approaches. That's something that wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have all of the different actors at the table sharing knowledge, sharing experiences.
No, thank you so much. And I think it's kind of a very rich and very diverse field of actors that kind of are part of this consortium. So I think as we get ready to launch into the Q&A, I think we have already some questions that were sent directly to the panelists. I'm going to kind of ask one more question to all the panelists. So for those who have questions ready, don't hesitate to kind of prepare them. You have a few minutes before we really open it up. So I think my last question to you all, and whichever order you want to kind of proceed, is we evoked a lot of topics. We started off really defining the problem, going into kind of the nuances of, how, they are kind of treated or dealt with today. We've also talked about the importance of mobilizing different actors because, we can't go it alone. And then finally, I think I want to kind of ask this question and have it open in the sense that there's so many, I think, different things to think about in these more complex, humanitarian situations. Is there a particular dimension or angle that you wish people maybe were talking about more when we talk about self-reliance of refugees that we have not really evoked, or maybe not as much in depth in the conversation up till now? And to you panelists, I'll let you guys in whichever order you'd like.
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it, Jean, just real quickly, because I'm sure my colleagues have something to add here as well. But I would just come back to say that, while we realize the critical nature of everyone partnering, everyone coming together, we haven't really played out the private sector's role and the private sector's point of insertion into this dynamic. And I think as we tap, not business per se. I worked in business, and I did some corporate social responsibility on the business side. There's a role to play there as well. But I'm really excited, and obviously, and working in this finance space, by the potential of investment to be a durable sort of way for the private sector to engage. I already mentioned this idea of ESG investing and how it's really growing so much, and the appetite of the investor to do more, to do environmental stuff, but to do more social stuff as well, and for their appetite for new social investments, as well as for their appreciation for the displacement crisis that Celine, I think, so eloquently described at the outset of this call. It's never been worse. It's a crisis right now, and it's an all hands on deck sort of approach that we need to engage. And so I would just underscore that there are a lot of capital players that understand why, but they don't understand how, and they need to be brought to the table. They need to be educated. They need to see the potential of engaging in a sustainable way, and doing so in a very impactful way as well. So I would just say that the growth of this ecosystem, we feel, is an important part of the solution that needs to be, really built out and supported.
Yeah, I can build on that. I think one of the things that I'd really like to see more robust discussion on is something that I think Sasha mentioned very briefly at the outset, but it's on making self-reliance opportunities accessible for all refugees who desire to become self-reliant. We have talked a little bit about this holistic nature of self-reliance, that it really is more than an exclusive focus on livelihoods and what it takes to get there. I very much appreciate, Tim, what you mentioned at the RIN, how you've sort of come up with different profiles for different types of investments. So we're really building out and expanding this idea of, who could be a candidate for these programs. But still, I'd say in livelihoods programming, there often tends to be a focus traditionally on refugees that are deemed viable, or those that are likely to succeed. These programs often are targeting refugees that are ready to jump in and participate in a training program or receive startup capital with no additional support. And while that's valuable, it's really only scratching the surface of the incredible talent that exists out there. And so, that approach really misses the larger section of refugees that are not yet at that point, but with some tailored support, could become viable as small business owners, entrepreneurs, or workers, employees. And so I think as we talk about labor market integration for refugees and self-reliance and what it actually takes, we need to think a little bit more, or consider how we're building that pipeline of talent, and recognizing that really for the majority of refugees, that goes beyond business skills building, training, and really goes towards addressing some of their other needs. And I think it's important to note for people who may not be familiar with the range of needs, sometimes these needs or barriers could be as simple as, covering the cost of transportation to a training program or a work site, or the cost of a prescription medicine, for instance. But in many cases, these barriers may be more complex, such as finding reliable childcare, something that is not only limited to refugee populations, but something that countries around the world are grappling with. But it is a real factor. Or addressing instability in housing or food or safety. And so while that seems like a lot, and sort of a way to, sometimes it almost seems like we might dilute the issue by saying, well, we have to tackle everything. It's true, we do. But we also know that it's possible. And I'll just sort of end by mentioning that, in Nairobi, Refuge Point has a holistic service model that moves highly at-risk refugees, those that are considered vulnerable, along a progression of services that starts with really stabilizing their basic needs to the point where they're equipped to establish small businesses and eventually are able to support themselves with their own earnings. And this approach really sort of differs from the traditional programs that I mentioned, because we are targeting the most vulnerable, and we support them and work with them till they get to a point where they become viable as small business owners, entrepreneurs, workers. And so I just sort of want to add that I think, as we're thinking about integration into the labor force, or what it takes to be self-reliant, or we're thinking about investments, just really encouraging us to broaden our scope, to think about increasing accessibility to self-reliance opportunities for all refugees who desire to become self-reliant and are able to do so, and that it really requires all of us to work together to address some of those barriers and design programs that address as many needs as possible. And so, I think we have a good group here to do some brainstorming about that, but just wanted to add that.
Thank you. And maybe to Celine?
Yes, I think there are two things I want to highlight here. One, and it was part of the questions you were thinking of asking us, but we don't have enough time, but I still wanted to talk about good practices as well. And not one example, but one thing I think is really important, and it's the participation of refugees, because something that has inspired me a lot, and also over the past year, is the many initiatives by refugees themselves. That gives us the strength to continue. By many refugee talents, and I think, there are so many initiatives that have been presented to me about training courses, initiatives to continue language training, entrepreneurship, all the issues of interest to us and to refugees. And I think that's something very important to take into account, to really work on the participation of refugees, how to include refugees in decision-making processes for decisions that impact them. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And we started working on that with our government partners and various partners to see how we can work on the participation of refugees in France and other countries. And then one dimension I think needs action as well is to talk specifically about economic inclusion of refugee women and the specific challenges they face. And Simar has mentioned that as well, but I think that's one area where we need more work, because here too we've seen the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on refugee women and girls, from access to education, because we're very worried about now the access to education of refugee girls, including secondary education, and the risks girls are facing now if they don't access secondary education, like early marriages or early pregnancy, but also challenges refugee women face in accessing employment, in accessing decision-making processes. And I think there is still work to do by us all, all actors together on that specifically, and together with refugee women, again, highlighting the need for participation. So I think these are the 2 points I wanted to mention.
Thank you. And I think I want to make sure we leave time for questions. And so as promised, I probably will take some that are already in the chat that were sent to us. There are some that are specifically addressed to certain panelists. So I'll start with that. We have Rose here from Refugee Kenya. The question she has is to Refuge Point. She says, I appreciate the lens of tapping upon the capacities of the refugees. Have you addressed other policy or capital barriers to their socioeconomic well-being?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Rose. I think it's really crucial to sort of start by recognizing that the fact that we talk about self-reliance is the starting point for that is sort of acknowledging that the system that we're working in isn't fit for purpose. I think, Celine, as you mentioned, we're in year 10 of saying every single year, this is the worst year for the refugee crisis. The numbers are increasing. People are staying displaced for longer periods of time. And so certainly when we talk about self-reliance, we don't intend to put the burden solely on refugees to buck up and manage themselves. It's really, I would say, a call or a challenge to all of us who are involved in refugee response to do better, given that the system isn't working. And so a key part of that is centering refugee voices, listening to what their priorities are for becoming and staying self-reliant, but also continuing to do the hard work, the long work of ensuring that they are able to access their rights. And so I think that's really the question that Rose is getting to. And in that, we see government agencies as being critical partners in this work. Host governments are in some ways doing the hardest work of hosting refugees. And we continue to work with them at the national level, at the regional level, at the international level, through things like the Global Compact on Refugees, the Global Refugee Forums, where there are many pledges that are made to do better, but also sometimes at the county level, at the sort of state level, to make sure that they are aware of and doing whatever they can, the authorities in charge, to create these enabling environments for refugees. One example of that, maybe to get very specific to the point that Rose asked, we've in Nairobi, we've worked with the National Health Insurance Fund over the last couple of years to make sure that our refugee clients in Nairobi have access to that National Health Insurance Fund. That was a conversation that was years in the making, but it was a success story because it's allowed for a layer of social protection to extend to refugees. So that's really where we see government agencies as being partners in this effort.
Thank you so much. I think that's, in terms of the types of, solutions that are needed to kind of really think about that. And I think maybe another question we have is for Tim regarding the question, are there any refugee lens investment vehicles in North America for smaller investors? Any resources around that?
Sure. And let me make a disclaimer at the outset. Like I said, we're not a fund. We're not endorsing any of the investments that I'll talk about, but we're just trying to facilitate capital. And so take this no way as an endorsement or whatever, but just as, an organization that's trying to build this field out. And so, yes. So let me give just a few examples again to add a little bit more color to what we're talking about here. And I'll give a few examples and then I'll come to the one in the United States that we're so involved with and so excited about. But one of the companies that we've done some work with is called 734 Coffee. This was started by someone who's a Sudanese lost boy who immigrated to the United States, but today still sources his coffee and gives back to his community that he came from in Sudan. They're opening up a store in Juba in South Sudan right now. That's the sort of entrepreneur that we hear about from time to time. But to go back to Samer's point, which is those are few and far between. I think if you ask most people who have been displaced, they don't want to be an entrepreneur. Maybe they're not ready to be an entrepreneur and aren't set up to be. They want a job. And so some of the other investments and most of the investments that we come in contact with are those that are our 3 and our 4 sorts of organizations, like an organization we heard recently about called AirTM, which is a peer-to-peer banking technology, mostly designed for Venezuelans living outside of Venezuela so that they can receive hard currency in exchange for Venezuelan currency. There's another one called Cocoa for Peace, which is an agricultural interest based in Southern Colombia, which is using blockchain technology to help cocoa farmers who have been forcibly displaced, IDPs in Colombia, to get good value for their crop and be sure that their crop makes it to market and is traceable. The one in the United States, I think Jan or Jan asked a question about that I'll just give an example of, is a good example of an R6 investment, which is, to remind you all from my earlier going over, is a refugee investing fund. In other words, a fund that invests in those R1 through 4 investments called Launch Capital Partners. And they're putting money into affordable housing for new Americans, clean, safe, affordable housing with no aspirations to gentrify that housing, but they're a provider of affordable housing and a private equity fund that's raising money to place that money along those lines. So those are just, Jean, just a few examples of some of the firms that we're aware of working with, but there are many, many more. I'll just mention one in the African context, Gulu Agricultural Development Corporation, very large Ugandan cotton agricultural corporation. They own several gins, I think 3 or 4 gins. They source from people in large part that were displaced by the Lord's Resistance Army. They also source from South Sudanese that are living up in West Nile. They move them into leadership positions. They hire forcibly displaced people by the hundreds. And that's another great example of a good Africa agricultural interest that's a refugee lens investment that has really been great to work with as well. I don't know, Simar, can you hear me? I think Jean's frozen there. Oh, there you are.
I can hear you.
Okay.
All right, so I think maybe if we're going to try and be a little bit ambitious and get, you know, in terms of the time that's left, maybe I'll try and group the questions. So I think if panelists are able to note down or jot down, I'm going to throw at you a row of questions, and then hopefully we can try and address more than one, so we can get through that. From Olivier, we have a question regarding if the panel could give examples, so I think this is addressed to more broadly, examples of valuable approaches to integrate psychosocial support into refugee empowerment initiatives. So that's a first question. And then we have a potential question also to all panelists from Ariadna, who is an entrepreneur trying to set up a communications agency integrated by at least 75% refugees. Her question is how to sell this project to investors and potential clients as a serious business, and how to position this as something that our society needs. So, and then the last one I think I'm going to try and group in is for Celine from Rose on the Global Compact, which was supposed to help, you know, really ease this burden for refugee hosting countries. But there's a situation of, I think, in the Kenya operation, potentially shrinking funds, and you know what could be, I think, regarding the situation, you know, potential solutions to that. So, don't know if the panelists you kind of caught all that, but if you guys would like in any order to kind of address the question from Olivier on psychosocial support into refugee empowerment initiatives, the specific question about, you know, pitching the project that Ariadna has, and then the question on the Global Compact and Kenya specifically.
I'm happy to start with the first question on psychosocial support. It's a really good question, and I think it sort of goes back to the points that we were making earlier about what it actually takes to help refugees become and stay self-reliant. And, you know, a key part of that is ensuring that each refugee family has the full range of supports that they need in order to enter the labor force, or, you know, in order to really provide for themselves and their families in a sustainable way. And so one of the aspects that is sometimes overlooked is making sure that there is access to adequate health supports. We know from our experience in Kenya and with you know, what we've heard from our partners around the world, that often it's a chronic health condition in the family, which could be physical or mental health related, that is a key driver in preventing refugees from being able to successfully run businesses or go to work or enter the labor force. And that's something that's often hidden. It's not addressed by agencies that are looking to provide support for livelihoods. And so I think this question, if I can expand it a little bit, is really about, it's in some ways, I would say, a defense or a justification for taking that broader view of what the various needs are within a refugee household to make sure that they are receiving all of the related supports that they need to be able to participate adequately in the labor force. Mental health support is a key aspect of that. There are many agencies that are sort of exclusively providing or focusing on mental health and psychosocial support for refugees. And some of the ways in which we've seen this done well, or that we encourage our partners to integrate this, is to ensure that if they notice or see from their conversations with refugees, even if they themselves are not providing that service, to make referrals to partner agencies that are doing that work. This work is very ambitious, it's multifaceted, and it's going to be difficult for any single agency to do it at scale. And so that's where referrals and collaboration with other partners comes in. But I would like to underscore that, psychosocial support should be seen as a core service or a core need to help refugees really, truly participate in the labor force.
And I guess for the remaining two questions, maybe would, Celine, do you want to take the one on Global Compact, and then maybe Tim, the entrepreneurial project one?
Yes, and maybe I can add just one thing to the question on psychosocial support and to be along what Simar said. I think it's very important. So very often, and it's related to the second question as well, on the lack of funding and the shrinking sometimes of funding for refugee responses and programs. Very often, psychosocial support for refugees is not an area where there is a lot of funding. And there are actors, NGOs, experts in that and doing an amazing job, in various countries. And I think it's important, and that's also, our job at UNHCR, to raise attention about the need to support projects linked to psychosocial support for refugees, but also to work with those partners who are experts and include them in projects, to design projects that are holistic and that respond to different needs. So while designing an integration project for refugees, for example, have an aspect on access to employment, language training, but also psychological support. So I think, that's important to take that into account while designing projects and to work together with partners who are specialized on that. So that's one thing. And then on the second question, unfortunately, and we see too worldwide, because of what I said, protracted refugee situations, new crises, new needs, budgets worldwide are increasing, like the needs are increasing, but funding is not increasing. There are so many situations worldwide where our programs are only 20% to 30% funded, and we already, at mid-year of 2021. So that's really a challenge. And we are calling on the generosity of donors, and you may have seen, various donor conferences that are being organized for the situation in Venezuela situation, neighboring countries, lately Yemen, the Sahel, countries hosting Syrian refugees, Bangladesh. So what we're trying to do as well is we're trying to widen our partners, including, donors, working more with the private sector, and really trying to get more funding sources. So that's one thing. But then the Global Compact on refugees is also to mobilize various partners to find solutions for refugees, not only by funding programs, but also by finding concrete solutions for access to employment, innovative solutions, which are not, all linked to funding initiatives, but really developing programs, like companies developing programs to train refugees, to provide employment to refugees. As I said, companies developing programs to develop distance learning for refugees. So these are very important components of the Global Compact for refugees, including legal pathways for refugees and the pledges made by states for more resettlement places, for private sponsorship, for scholarship for refugees. So we are trying to mobilize various partners, including, in the area of sports, sports clubs who can bring support to refugees, have access to sports. In France lately, we've developed a partnership with an NGO and a football club, to develop sports center for Rohingya refugees and the host communities in Bangladesh. So these are very important parts of the Global Compact on refugees as well, mobilizing partners who can develop projects.
Thank you. And then maybe just to finish it off, Tim, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I will. I look forward to addressing that. Let me just mention on this last question that Celine spoke to as well. We haven't probably in this call spoken enough about hosts and the importance of engaging with hosts as well. And I'll just point out that we define host communities within our definition and within our taxonomy as well. And in our field work that's ongoing currently in Mexico and Colombia and Uganda and Jordan, we have our local teams on the ground, and so we get a pretty good view of what's going on in this post-COVID environment, and it's tough. It's very tough, and it's a tough time to sell sort of refugee initiatives. And so we're going through a lot of thinking about, how do we highlight the engagement that we have with host communities as well, and how we really do seek to draw investment into those communities and jobs into those communities, just as we do in the communities of the displaced people as well. It's really important for, I think, our whole community, our ecosystem, to really appreciate what everybody's going through, especially now with the COVID. On the question about the entrepreneur, I think this would be a great project. 75% of the workforce would be refugees. Embrace it, take it head on. That's your differentiator, I would say. And can you imagine a workforce that's that diverse, and the new thinking that they would be able to bring to an account or something? I don't know if you've ever met a refugee that's not multilingual, that doesn't have a certain perspective, that doesn't bring just a ton to the table. And on top of that, I would use data, which we've tried to do. We've got a report, our flagship report, really for the Refugee Investment Network, really brings a lot of data to bear to show how innovative, how gritty, loyal employees, entrepreneurial. We use the figure in the United States that almost 50% of the Standard & Poor's 500 companies were founded by first or second generation Americans, right? These sorts of statistics, make people think about who really are the innovators and the gritty, hardworking, entrepreneurial people. So bring those statistics to bear as well, and come up with a great brand and a great pitch, and you should have success.
I think we're running just about out of time, and I think I want to thank, first of all, the panelists. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I think it was very, very insightful, and I think coming at it from so many angles. We talked about indexes, we talked about, big consortiums, we talked about really thinking about treating problems holistically, whether that's, thinking about the different pathways, the different types of actors that need to engage at different steps. Also to the participants, those who stayed up until the end, and the questions you asked as well. So we really, I think, moving forward, and I think that's why we're all probably here today on this call, that these types of issues regarding livelihoods, regarding economic inclusion, and the types of actors we need to be engaged, whether that's institutions, NGOs, investors, the private sector, I think we need to really be engaged, but at different moments. And so, hope to, continue this conversation. We'll probably try and send out to those who signed up on the Eventbrite some links from the call regarding the different resources we discussed. And with that, I wish you all a good afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much again for your participation.